So we're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Paper number 69. And this is entitled The Real Character of the President, and subtitled this, He's Not a King, which is essentially what Hamilton is getting at in this paper. As he goes through, he kind of talks about what the anti-federalists believe is going to happen under what they consider to be a strong president who, in their estimation, will become a king, versus the realities of the powers given to the president. And Hamilton tries to contrast these two things in an effort to be able to show that really, in every instance that we take a look at the powers of the president, they are in no way like a king. And in some respect or manner, there is always a check against the president, given the powers that are allotted to the president. So the Anti-Federalists were particularly concerned of all the different institutions about the presidency. Remember that the new United States, after having fought the Revolutionary War, was very leery of the idea of a strong executive power, given what they had been through with King George III, and government was focused on having weak executives. And as we get into the discussion of what the Federalist Papers have to say about the presidency, we see that there was a great defense, and the argument being that we did need to have somebody that could control one focal point of government that could control negotiations and various other things with other countries and also make the government work well. But the Anti-Federalists were concerned about the powers of the presidency. So there were a couple of things that they were concerned about. One was the idea of having a unitary executive. There were a number of theories out there at the time that basically we would not have a single person, or some discussion of dividing the president into multiple powers. The Constitution of Pennsylvania of 1776 didn't actually even have a president or an executive or governor at that point in time. So there was a worry that there was just too much power given to one person. The second thing that the Anti-Federalists were concerned about was the concept of the veto. And they were interested in the fact that the president could intervene in any type of public policy issues that were being considered by Congress, so that the president could influence all legislation. And why should one person have the same amount of power as Congress as a collective body could? So they were concerned about that. A third thing was the idea of the commander-in-chief. And they were concerned that the ability to be able to use the military and direct the military would ultimately end up in the United States, or the new country, being a military dictatorship, because the president can call out and use troops at his particular will whenever necessary, including during fights with other branches of the government, federal government. They also thought that the idea of a 4-year term was far too long for the president, and wanted 1-year terms or 2-year terms at most. And also the fact that until the presidency of Harry S. Truman, we did not have a formal constitutional limit on the amount of terms that a president can serve. So there was some fear that somebody could come along, be elected president every 4 years, and maintain power and become, in essence, a monarch. One other concern that they had was in the area of pardoning powers of the presidents. And there was some fear that the presidents would have his lackeys or his friends who would be able to commit crimes or unseemly or unwieldy kind of actions. And then the president, through the ability to be able to pardon people, would be able to get his friends off, and the president could profit from that. Then finally, and this is kind of a lesser kind of question, but there was some question about the vice president being the Senate president of the United States Senate and overseeing the Senate's actions. And if we look at that, the view was that by nature, the separation of powers would warrant the vice president not being an official member of the legislative branch. So they were concerned about that. Now the question is, from the perspective, as we see from Hamilton's discussion here, is he really addresses these head on. Doesn't necessarily discount the fact that this might not be a problem, but basically says, let's not get too overzealous about this concern about executive power, because the president, when we compare with a king, particularly the King of England here, and at some points actually compares the president to the governor of New York, who had more constitutional powers under the New York Constitution than did the president. The president is not a king, and the president is powers are checked at every corner. So let's take a look at a couple of these things that the Anti-Federalists were concerned about, and work our way through how the power of the presidency is actually checked. First is the idea of tenure. So the president is elected by the Electoral College under the Constitution every 4 years. So there is a terminal amount of time after which the president needs to be reelected through a democratic election, albeit indirect. On top of that, they do have unlimited terms, but the idea would be that the Electoral College would stop somebody who was violating kind of the terms of the Constitution. Hamilton says, let's think about the king. On the other hand, well, the president's got a 4-year term. The king's term is hereditary and basically serves, from the time that they are crowned until the time of their death or of a revolution. Second thing is the removal of the president. There are constitutional mechanisms in the new Constitution of the United States that would allow the president to be removed from office. So the process is that the House of Representatives would impeach the president, and then there will be a trial in the United States Senate in which, if the president were convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors, would be removed from office, right? Now, contrast that with the king, in which there was no formal constitutional removal power whatsoever in England. So, in essence, the king was responsible to no constitutional tribunal depending on his actions, and really the only way that you could remove the king was not through the constitutional mechanisms of impeachment and then conviction, but rather really only by a revolution or somehow killing off the king. Second thing that the third thing that the Anti-Federalists were worried about was this idea of the president having too much power over legislation vis-a-vis the veto. Hamilton says, well, okay, this is an enormous power for the president to be able to wield, but if you think about it, what you see is that the 2/3 override that Congress can engage in if they think a piece of legislation should be passed is one way that we have the qualified veto. And if a piece of legislation is good enough or constitutional and the president vetoes it, then Congress has a means to kind of end run around the president. Therefore, this is not an absolute veto, it's a qualified veto. On the other hand, the king has an absolute veto. Once the king vetoes a piece of legislation or an act, there is no way for any kind of constitutional body or the House of Commons, House of Lords, or Parliament to be able to end run around him. The concept of the commander-in-chief and the president being too powerful, well, yes, so the president is the commander-in-chief. However, Congress also has a number of constitutional powers in relationship to the military. And the first is the power to be able to declare war. And the second is the power to be able to appropriate funding for military actions. So the president does not have the clear ability to engage in all military actions in every realm, as whereby the king has war-making power and the power of the purse. How about in relationships with other nations? Well, the president has the ability to be able to negotiate treaties with other countries. However, once those treaties are negotiated, it doesn't necessarily mean that those treaties become forceful by law, because the United States Senate is tasked with the ability to be able to confirm those treaties or ratify those treaties. The king, on the other hand, has absolute power. And then finally, thinking in terms of the appointment power of the president, the major, what would come to be known as kind of cabinet offices, were essentially nominated by the president, and there's been great discretion, but the Senate still does have the power of advice and consent not to confirm somebody if they don't think, for whatever reason, they are capable of doing the job or have something in their past that's not good. On the other hand, the king has an absolute appointment power, unlike the president. So in looking at this, what we see then is in all of these different categories, whether it's term of office, the ability to be able to be removed by another branch of the government, the power to influence legislation, the power and control over the military, the power to be able to negotiate with other countries, or the power to be able to really set up your own government. At every point, Hamilton says, we see the president being checked in some way, generally by Congress. On the other hand, the power of the president is absolute. And let me just end this kind of discussion with a brief kind of portion of Federalist 70 directly from the Federalist Papers. He says, the one can confer no privilege whatever, meaning the president, of course. The other can make denizens of aliens, noblemen of commerce, can erect a corporation with all the rights incident to corporate bodies. The one can prescribe no rules concerning the commerce or currency of the nation. The other is in several respects the arbiter of commerce, and in this capacity can establish markets and fairs, can regulate weights and measures, can lay embargoes for a limited time, can coin money, can authorize or prohibit the circulation of foreign coin. The one has no particle of spiritual jurisdiction. The other is the supreme head and governor of the national church, i.e. the king being the head of the Church of England, Anglican Church. What answer shall we give to those who would persuade us that things so unlike resemble each other? The same that thought to be given to those who would tell us that a government, the whole power of which will be in the hands of the elective and periodical servants of the people, is an aristocracy, a monarchy, and a despotism. In other words, Hamilton's saying this is just inflammatory rhetoric on behalf of the anti-federalists. And at the end of the day, our separation of powers system worked through the constitutional design of checks and balances will end up making the president adequately powered, but not with too much power.